Okay. S- so thank you so much for all of you, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever you are. And this is welcome to our webinar on rethinking capitalism and economic order. That is the part of our webinar series that we organize by the History Economy working group of the Young Scholar Initiative. And this series, we invite all of you to think about capitalism, that we try to connect economic idea with historical, political, and social world that shapes capitalism. So our aim is that we try to create a space for us as a young scholar with senior scholars, also that who expert in capitalism. We discuss about theory from Marxist, classical, feminist or ecological idea that link to capitalism. And last, I think maybe it's a month ago that we had our first session with Professor Kenarina, uh, that he spoke about her book on the law of
On the
capitalism.
web for economies start working through. When as Ethan, we conclude.
Sorry, but the problem with my computer. But anyway, so she talked about her new book about the law of capitalism and how to transform it. And yeah, I think that the participant that joined us last week has a great discussion with her. But today we have special that we still count on you to engage with the discussion, and we are honored to welcome Professor Baras Harris White, one of the most distinguished author and scholar in political economy and then in the study of informal capitalism. And I just want to debrief her background for you not familiar with her. So Professor Harris White is the Emeritus Professor of Development Study and Emeritus Fellow at Watson College, University of Oxford. And he is also the research fellow at the Mark Webber Foundation for South Asian Study in New Delhi, in India, and chair of the Young Scholars Seminar at the Foundation for Agrarian Study in Bangalore. So her career spent decades of rigorous field-based research on agrarian market, informal economy, deprivation, waste, and political economies of the South Asian. She has she has supervised around 42 doctoral students and monitor as many doctoral scholars and authors and co-author over 40 books, too many books. Yes, and also yeah, 143 academic paper, and she also co-author author of around 153 book chapter. So I think you can find her work online. So yes, a lot of publication that you can read from her work. So she also the director of Queen Isabel House in Oxford, and was funding director from the Oxford Master Program in Development Study and Comparative South Asian Study Program. So today, Professor why we discuss about the different approach into formality, and we talk about the challenge our conventional boundaries used to describe informality in informal economy activity. So I just debrief about what she wrote in the description about what we are going to discuss today. That she wrote that Indian informal economy is established as the largest in the world, comprising almost all employment and probably just under the half of GDP. So this is through to be declining. The theoretical generally as informal activities as weak the categories of the state with academic health to you. It marks the binary and duty, unorganized, and unprotected and uncooperative, etc. So in this lecture, she will expose the different conjecture that the state of categorization, informal economy activity, negotiate the politic of selective enforcement of state regulative law and recall interventive selective like voluntary and selective complement of them. So they also use the experiment with AI, collaborative with material from seven cases using her own fieldwork and incomplete exploration, and also indicate that informal economy is Biswas too. So we are truly appreciate for your time to join us today. So the floor is yours, and I would like to welcome all of you to welcome Professor Harris Y. Thank you.
Thank you, Kosal, for that introduction. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, without more ado, I will share my screen and begin my talk. Share. Now, screen sharing. Oh, slideshow from the start. Can everybody see it? Whoops. Can you see my...
Yes, everything all right. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll begin. For me, this is a special occasion. I want to air an argument with you because you are young researchers, and I am very eager to get feedback about this approach, both method and substance. I'm going to talk about India, and I know that you are all located all over the place, not necessarily in India. So one of the things that I'll be interested in is whether this resonates with you, whether you think that where you're working, it might make sense, or whether it doesn't make sense at all. And if it doesn't make sense, why? So afterwards, I'm very eager to learn from your feedback. So my talk will have 4 parts to it. In the first part, I will go over quite quickly the genealogies, the family histories of the body of theory that relates to informal sector, informal economy, excuse me, informal labor. And with those theoretical ideas, I'm going to add the conceptual apparatus of the Indian state. And again, it'll be very interesting to know how the state handles these concepts where you are. But what I'm going to build is an argument about the tyranny of binaries, of duality. And I'm going to argue that informality is pervasive and that the regulation of the formal sector and the interface between formal registered activity and informal unregistered activity is a very complicated non-spatial frontier across which there's all kinds of politics going on. So I'm going to build a hypothesis about actually existing capitalism being ordered through the selective enforcement of a body of law which regulates the market on the side of the state, and selective adherence or compliance on the side of the economy with this body of law. And with that hypothesis, we're all implicated in the problems of method, how to reinterpret case material to substantiate it or refute it, where that case material was certainly not collected for that purpose. And also the question of explicitly using AI as a research assistant. So the main meat of the talk, having introduced the ideas, will be the experiment using AI and what I learned from it, and then looking at the question with a different kind of evidence, which is case material, and the insights from case material. And the last part of the talk will be extrapolating from these two experiments to generate some hypotheses for further research and some speculations. So that's what I want to skate through in the next few minutes. So part one is all about theoretical ideas. And I think people in the audience are probably quite familiar. So I will go through it fairly quickly. Informal economy has now been very thoroughly theorized and very thoroughly criticized. And that body of theory and ideas does structure what we think we know about it. Firstly came Keith Hart, who died about a fortnight ago, sadly, who invented the concept of the informal economy in 1972, studying the Frafra in Accra. And for him, and this was taken up by the ILO in their study of Kenya, informality referred to very small-scale activity, which was geared to surviving, was sort of seasonal, ad hoc, nighttime activity, often petty crime, and so on and so forth. After that came several theorists, Caroline Moser, Castells and Porters, arguing that the informal economy was not temporary and not necessarily geared to survival, but it was part of a structure in the economy, and that the informal economy was essential for the registered, formal, state-regulated economy. It will be permanent, and it was deliberately developed in order to escape state regulation, particularly to escape tax. About a decade later came De Soto's legalist theory, in which the informal economy was a manifestation of poor and insecure property rights. And the thing to do was to establish clear, defendable property rights, which would unleash a great cascade of entrepreneurial energy. Another decade or more, Marty Chen reconceived theory of informal economy to pertain particularly to wage labor. By then, globalization had bitten into all countries of the world, and in an effort to cut costs and to compete inside the corporate economy and inside state corporations and state bureaucracies, labor had been informalized. In other words, that was also a process which was theorized as permanent. And we know that developing out of Marty Chen's findings is a lot of work on precaritization inside formal entities, the gig economy and so on and so forth in India, whether they're partners or whether they're very exploited wage workers or what the heck they are. Anyway, this body of theory, it's not a single theory, but it certainly compromises a simple idea of there being a dual formal, informal economy. Now, less are kind of integrated into that genealogy, but definitely sitting there from the 1990s onwards. Bob Jessup and David Harvey, Colin Lees, talking about the commodification, the privatization of the state, and the undemocratic politics that arises from informalization and privatization via the hegemony of market-driven politics over democratic politics. A number of people have had to draw the conclusion that when the state is privatized to private entities, it nevertheless generates informal hybrid institutions and practices that are partially formed and organized by the state, but actually are pervaded by market behavior. Asim Prakash has called them hybrid institutions and practices, and that's quite a useful concept to park. And lastly, we have neo-Sanyalian or Sanyalian and the legacy of Sanyalian political economy from 2007 onwards, which is explicitly post-colonial, in which the informal economy is part of a dual economy, that because of the persistence of primitive accumulation into the present, post-colonies develop dual economies, an accumulation economy, capitalist economy on the one side, and a need economy, which has a whole host of names: subsistence economy, poor, peasants, artisans, disposable people, ancient forms even. But the informal economy is one of those epithets that is used to describe part of the economy that doesn't seem to be behaving as in volume 1 of Capital. And the question to you is whether all these processes coexist where you are. They certainly coexist in India, and they do that because India is so socially segmented. Okay, now to turn to the state's own categories. And the first point to make about this is that the state actually identified the registered economy, which it proceeded to regulate many decades before it did the same thing with the residual, with the informal economy. So the non-state regulated economy is belated. It was classified in the wake of the classification of the registered economy. And the state also works just as the theory works, with a whole set of binaries. And on the slide, they are listed in the order, not in which the state first used them, but in which they were first kind of subject to formal publication. So first came unorganized. Organized, the opposite, came in the 1950s over the politics of Provident Fund, but unorganized had to wait till about 1972. Unorganized means not regulated for work rights and for social security, but it adds also farms and all activities with fewer than 10 laborers. So it's quite a complicated residual category. Own account enterprise was a concept adopted in the economic census a bit later, in the late 70s. Unprotected labor, labor which doesn't have work or social security rights, had to wait officially until the National Sample Survey in 1999. Micro, small and medium enterprise has been around a long time, but not classified officially until the MSME Act well into the 21st century. And although incorporated appeared first in the Companies Act in the late 19th century, when India was still a British colony, well, was very much a British colony then, the idea of unincorporated as an official category wasn't legally registered and regularly used for statistical purposes until 2021. So the state is also using binaries, but it's using a whole set of binaries. And they come a long time after their regulated opposites. How am I going? Right. So this slide is simply summarizing that argument that we have a love affair with binaries, both theoretically and in the state statistics. We have registered, unregistered, recorded, unrecorded, monitored, unmonitored. We have capital and labor, a lot of binaries. And informal, which is the kind of umbrella binary, is a bit rare, is rather rarely used by the state. When the state uses it, rather than academics, it's referring to all activities which are not registered, taxed, or protected. So it's a residual term, and it's a bigger set of firms than the unorganized sector, which is a bigger set of entities than unprotected workers. And we have the recent appearance in India, and I don't know where you are in the audience, but perhaps where you are, of this term nano, because the truth of the matter is that an umbrella term like informal is covering a vast part of the economy. And that small minority of policymakers who are concerned with small entities and units now realize that micro is quite big in the Indian economy, and we need another term for very, very, very small. So nano has started to appear first in terms of technology and now occasionally for entrepreneurs. Okay, so this is an image which is perhaps much more lively than anything I've said, but it's of the blind men feeling and elephant. And I feel that's rather what theory and what the Indian state is doing with unregistered activity, unregulated activity in the Indian economy. Now, if we accept that the binaries are crude and abandon binary approaches, what happens? Well, then our theoretical world explodes. And the problem is, yes, it's complicated, but it won't go away if we ignore it. When the state doesn't or won't regulate institutions, and then institutions other than the state, non-state institutions, become sites of political agency and economic conflict and power relations. So those institutions which are most studied in India, and again, this is India biased, and it may not be the same where you are class, religion, caste, ethnicity, clan and kinship, gender, space and place, language and age, and in the marketplace itself, business associations and trade associations, which form a kind of socially corporatist tessellation or cellularity in the economy. Now, all of these institutions are often edged out of economics as a field for anthropology or sociology, certainly not economics. But the problem is that they all are avenues for the exercise and practice of forms of authority which actually matter in the economy. They have economic effects. So right on the very edge of economics and in political economy is a body of literature grounded in fieldwork, which looks mainly at each of these institutions by itself and asks, what are the power relations associated with them? One of the major findings is the smallness of the unit of regulative accountability, of regulative power. When as economists, we're very familiar with the nation or the state or the province or the district as a unit for governance. These units are very small, and they're also shaped very differently over space. The theory that is most apt after a big theoretical scouring operation 20, 30 years ago, I found that the social structure of accumulation school, which came out of the University of Massachusetts, Kotz, McDonough, and Reich, is a theory which is actually applied to the macroeconomy and actually inspired by business cycles. But what it does do is set up a set of hypotheses that when the economy is not regulated by the state, there is a kind of matrix of institutions, such as the ones listed in red on this slide, which work together as a kind of nurturing crucible or a matrix for the economy. And the economy will relate to those institutions, and those institutions will relate to each other. So long before intersectionality was a buzzword in feminist theory and political science, this was a theory which insisted that capitalism doesn't develop in a vacuum, that there is a matrix of institutions, and that we must study that matrix. So in South Asia, it's been developed in many ways that differ from the parent theory of business cycles. And Alessandra Mitsadri at SOAS is the latest person to have adapted it as a social structure of exploitation and not just of accumulation, and a social structure of reproduction, by which she means social reproduction of classes. And this body of theory really supports the idea that we must be sensitive to capitalism in many forms it takes in empirical reality, rather than try to reject forms as non-capitalist, and that it's our duty as empirical researchers to study the balance of class forces with these other institutions, and that we know that that balance will be specific. And that's where history and geography and politics play a big role in the study of the economy. Okay. So what this is working up towards is an idea that the regulation of the informal economy is far from a binary. If we look at a small town, and the photographs show money lending in the top right, building regulations in the top center, power supply in the top left, waste going down the left-hand side, and the labor force bottom left. And down the bottom, as a diagram which shows all the way in which tax evasion takes place in India. What we find is that in a firm which, when I started out over 50 years ago, which might not even have been registered, we now have this. We have a firm in a small town like the one on the previous slide, which is licensed. Okay, so it's not unlicensed, it's licensed with the municipality. It does have bank accounts. It might even have several or many. And at the same time, it works in the unregulated, informal financial economy. There are building regs to cover the standards of the shop, but I give a gift to the building inspector when he comes and he just goes away. So I can avoid those building regs. Then I do have electricity. I might not have had 55 years ago, but I do now, and it's metered and I pay for it. But I also tap it from the electricity poles in the street. I know nothing about the labour laws. I know very little about environmental regulations. A little old lady comes and sweeps the mess from my workshop at the end of the day. I know very little about the laws of commodity regulation. I pay lip service if somebody comes round and says you must put up price information. I do pay tax. I pay professional and property tax, but I only pay it in part. I don't pay what I ought to pay, and I pay it on the very last day of the tax year with a lot of delay. And I prefer to work in cash in order to avoid sales taxes. Okay, so that is the reality of the informal economy in the 21st century. No matter how the binary tyrannizes our theoretical universe, our empirical universe, their empirical universe is very complicated. So I generate a hypothesis from that, from this contradiction between the ballooning duality of theory and discourse about informality and the ballooning complexity of how informal firms operate in the real economy. So the hypothesis is that actually existing informality is the product of the selective enforcement by the state of regulative law and the selective adherence or compliance by economic agents in the market. And that is why I've called this talk a different approach to informality. And we can mesh that hypothesis in very easily with this social structure of accumulation, of discrimination, of exploitation approach to the institutions through which the economy is regulated, which are non-state institutions. Okay, so I now want to move to part 2, which is an experiment with AI. Because armed with this hypothesis, a whole slew of questions then suggest themselves in a literature which, with a background in political economy, I still am very unfamiliar with. So over the summer, I asked AI 58 exploratory questions which are relevant to the politics of selective regulation. Now, this is for India, and the results are for India. And what you find, if it interests you, could be very different. I got 93,000 words of response out of only 350 sources. I mean, for many of you, 350 references is a lot. But actually, if we're looking at systematic reviews, that is not a very big universe of material, which suggests that these questions haven't probably been very much researched. So I didn't want AI to limit the way it searched its universe. So I used 2 terms which were deliberately unspecific, big business and small family business, to refer to the whole economy. And these terms, this bimodal classification, can be well justified through the stylized facts about the Indian economy, that it's polarized through size and cost structures and social status and organization. And we have dominant firms and we have prominent firms, dominant in terms of numbers, dominant in terms of capital, assets, and prominent in terms of numbers. And asking AI in the full and certain understanding that AI itself distinguishes big business as quite a varied category. It's a dustbin. It is dominated by private limited capital and family dynasties, as well as the corporate sector, and that small family businesses are also varied, from very, very small enterprises through to small partnerships to firms which have generally fewer than 5 laborers. But in India, 95% of registered firms have fewer than 5 laborers. So we're talking about a vast part of the Indian economy. And over the summer, I did test how AI is sensitive to precision in questions. I won't go through that now. We might do that afterwards. But I used it as carefully as possible. And what I found is that AI is an incredibly fast research assistant, and probably just as accurate as about 2 years of research assistance in a space of 7 to 10 days. Okay, so what were my questions? I said I asked 58 questions, but there were 7 families of questions. So I asked AI, what are the most important formal regulative laws for big business and small family business? I said, which of those laws are written about as most selectively enforced? Because that's all the AI can only search for information that's on the internet already. Then I asked about thresholds for regulative coverage under which firms are not regulated and therefore informal. I asked about selective enforcement above and below the thresholds, about state-level incentives for adherence and compliance by economic agents in the economy, about social incentives for adhering with the law and complying with the law, and finally about the state's own vigilance institutions and their relations of vigilance. And so I've only given you 2 slides to talk about because, in fact, this exercise generated a loose baggy monster. It generated about 60 slides. So I'm just being very selective in what I show you to show the kind of result that this exercise generated and the sorts of conclusions that we can derive from it. Okay, so question 1 out of the 7 was about the main framework of regulative law. And what you can see from this very, very packed slide is that, and the numbers in brackets, by the way, by the title, are the number of references that AI found dealing with this question. So not a lot of references, but anyway, enough to back this list and to make it very clear that the regulative framework for big business is different from that for small family business. Big business is mostly concerned with money, income tax, insurance, all kinds of finance, bankruptcy, and so on and so forth. And small family business is mostly concerned with eligibility for state benefits of various kinds. Okay, so they're different regulative universes. And then I asked, and I'll summarize what I found in later slides, but this is the example of the answer for the very interesting question I innocently asked about the thresholds, because since our theoretical universes are dominated by dualities and binaries, I was completely unprepared for the result, just asking innocently about the legally sanctioned thresholds for the main regulative laws. And what comes out of that search is that the thresholds below which firms are not regulated, those thresholds are different for big business and small family business, and they're astonishingly varied. Some of them are expressed in rupee terms, turnover, revenue, assets. Some of them are expressed in economic terms, which are not given rupee values, particularly labor criteria for small family business. And some of them are expressed in terms of activity which is not economic at all, by technology, by specific kinds of packaging, by metrics of weights and measures and things like that. So big result, which I didn't expect, which was that there is no standard below which firms are informal. Those standards are themselves a big crenellated frontier. Okay. And so then I asked another question I never expected to ask, which is are companies that are under the threshold for a given regulation regulated? And if so, are they not regulated? Are they actually missed out? Is it a contradiction in terms? And the answer is no, it's not a contradiction in terms, because many laws don't have thresholds at all, including a lot of laws about labor. And some environment laws don't have thresholds below which a firm is unregistered. And that those laws which don't have thresholds are practiced, are implemented in a way which can penalize units which are small, blocked, delayed implementation, careless implementation, weak or politicized enforcement. You'll see a list of technologies of power on this slide, and often very harassing and or neglectful enforcement, which creates uncertainty on the receiving end of these regulative laws. Then of the laws which do have thresholds, what are their effects of firms underneath the thresholds? Well, there are plenty of predictions about preemptive miniaturization, that many large firms create small firms in order to escape tax. Although they become the norm when most firms are preemptively miniaturized, they're also declassed because under the labor laws, even the employers may be classified as labor if they have fewer than 5 laborers, believe it or not, because they're regarded by the state as small employers who lack access to safeguards and social entitlements and so on and so forth. So a lot of Indian capital is actually legally classified as labor. Then it's clear that the state isn't always in possession of knowledge about the size of firms to be regulated. So there are very often punitive raids and harassment since the state doesn't have proof that the firms are actually underneath the threshold for regulation. Okay, so those practical consequences are greater the smaller the firm. But that question is a live question rather than a ridiculous question. Okay, so from that big exercise this summer, I've teased out conclusions from the 7 families of questions, only 2 of which I've actually, or 3 of which I've shown you now. The conclusions that the major regulative laws are very old and therefore path dependent, and many, some are colonial, and many long predate the replacement of the dirigist regulative regime of post-independence India by neoliberal regulation. Many of them embody contradictory principles, and many have been amended so many times that it's very difficult to understand exactly what they mean now, and they are inoperably vague. And they coexist with unrealistic data requirements. And the other big conclusion is that the regulative frame differs for big business and small business. But the big businesses involved in the processes of the informal regulation of the economy. The regulative law that's most apparently selectively enforced is a subset of regulative law, and it differs for the 2 stylized kinds of firm that I am trying to study. The legal thresholds differ significantly across dimensions which are incommensurable, and some major laws have no threshold below which a firm would be informal. And being underneath the threshold doesn't prevent state regulation. Those regulations of enforcement are system-wide, they're complex, and they vary hugely. The incentives that exist for voluntary adherence and compulsory compliance for fear of penalties also differ between big business and small family business. They're different kinds of incentives, and they're built into the regulative law. That's the 5 and 6, and I'm going to go on and talk about that a little bit later. And lastly, the way in which the Indian state enforced its law is through not just the police, but through an enormous set of hierarchized enforcement organizations that are also specific to sectors of the economy and different states and regions of India, and are quite different. Their scope is quite different, so that many people can escape enforcement if they conduct economic activity across borders, regulative borders, of which there are a colossal number in India. And the officials manning vigilance institutions are not specialists, they're generalists. They're deputed there for 2 or 3 years. They're not necessarily very motivated. They're seriously understaffed. And there are great variations in their capacity, official capacity. Banking and insurance is very well enforced, but labour and environment regulations are very poorly enforced. And much of their activity, much of their energy is directed at public institutions, at delinquency inside the state, and not in the economy at large. So this is a kind of architecture which invites discretion and micro politics. And there are all the regulations I have described and all the findings I have described are peppered with discretion and special cases and exemptions. So I hope what you're taking away is a big challenge to simplistic duality and its replacement by what, for me, right now, is a very complex landscape. So let us go to another way of knowing case material, to figure out how case material can contribute to our understanding of that landscape. Now, the problem of a substantive empirical exploration of this hypothesis is that the case material was never designed for these research questions. So what we have to do is read between the lines and try and build a general argument through what case material reveals. And so be very focused on a vast literature. And I've got 7 case studies, and again, it's a loose, baggy monster, and I'm only going to talk about 3 of them, and those very, very briefly here, because they're illustrative of the kinds of insight that a case study can give into the questions that we have to ask once we discover all this about the informal economy. Okay, so the first case study is from agriculture. Now, in India, most people studying informality breathe a huge sigh of relief because agriculture is known as informal. So these photographs here are suggestive of the idea that maybe not all of it is completely informal. One is of land, one is of electrifying, powering the fields for irrigation water, the top right picture. The third is a regulated marketplace, and the last is pesticide. Okay, so this is in a way anticipating what I'm going to say about agriculture, but it's a bit like the small town economy example that generated the hypothesis in the first place. So if we look at how agriculture is actually regulated, we can't these days just say, oh, it's in the informal economy. Because we know that land, some credit, agricultural inputs, extension information, and certain non-land activity is documented, it's registered. The documentation is often flawed or unavailable. That's another point about implementation, but it is registered. Then inputs like chemical fertilizer and pesticide are heavily regulated, but they're not regulated in their final uses. Other inputs like power, electricity, is monitored, even though it's maybe 100% subsidized and effectively free, it's still monitored by the electricity board, and you can extrapolate water use from the use of electricity. And it's really rather important for other purposes that the Indian state does have a guesstimate about how much water is being taken from underground. But a lot of agriculture remains not regulated or registered. Tenancies, labour, non-bank credit, the livestock economy, which is huge, extension, the content of mobile phones, the use of common property, grazing and pasture, and so on and so forth, is not regulated at all. Then we have the post-harvest system, and I will buzz over this very quickly because the post-harvest system is regulated, parts of it, but not all of it. The first transaction between a farmer and a trader is regulated through special institutions, places, regulated marketplaces. But the rest of the system is not so well regulated. And then the state itself regulates that first transaction, assuming that the rest of the system is satisfactorily efficient and can be left to its own devices. But at the same time, it has a whole series of state corporations built on exactly the opposite assumption, which is that markets are not operating efficiently, or people are too poor to get what they need from efficient markets. So you have a public distribution system in India with a whole slew, dozens and dozens of state organizations, which have been set up to run a state-controlled parallel system to that of the markets. Now, the point about that is that's formal, yes, but actually the way it operates is subject to all kinds of informal politics, which we need to know more about. Okay, so that's the insights from agriculture. Now, looking at the gold economy. Why do I look at gold? Because there's 5 times more gold tucked under mattresses and in cupboards in India than in Fort Knox, the global repository of gold reserves in America. And gold imports to India are equal to half foreign direct investment in India. India has a massive, massive economy of gold, and we've just produced a book about it. Now, what do we learn about regulation? Well, we learn a lot of things, and I've just picked a few. Gold in India is actually seamlessly part of a global system of production and distribution and crafting and smuggling of gold, where you have a moral economy of gold inside households, but it coexists with corporate economy, craft economy, and a big organized criminal economy worldwide. So the balance of criminal, semi-compliant, and compliant activity is very different at different places and stages inside the global gold economy. The second big insight you get from studying gold is that you can't study gold by itself. In the same way, you shouldn't be studying agriculture by itself, but they do. We all do. But gold provokes us in a way it's impossible to avoid. That the gold economy is fused with other kinds of commodity economy in the criminal system, for instance, with drugs, arms, capital flight, illicit finance, international land grabs, and so on and so forth. That gold generates byproducts, but not in an obvious way. We have the commodification of licenses for gold. We have pawnbroking industry of gold and a huge rural credit system relying on gold as collateral for loans. that what happens in the gold economy affects what happens in other commodities, in derived and regulated other sectors. We have a case study of gold and silk. Those two bits of the economy are hugely interrelated. What goes on in gold affects how much silk is able to be produced and the conditions under which it's produced into cloth. And finally, the regulations, and it follows from what I've just said, the regulations in one field have an impact on what happens in a derived or related sector. So gold is teaching us a lot about the complexity of this interface between regulated behavior and the unregulated economy out there. And lastly, state regulation of gold is polarized and very unstable. So it's been obsessed with how much gold is coming into India, how much gold is going out, whether it's being smuggled, whether it can be put to productive use, and how to control the quality of the final products through hallmarking and to prevent adulteration. So the state is constantly revising its regulations. And of course, that all has an effect on the firms that are operating underneath the thresholds for these dynamic and constantly revised regulations. Okay, so the last one I'll go through very quickly, and that is coal and fire, but coal, really. Although both are subject to case studies in our book, The Wild East, which is about the criminal economy of South Asia, not just India, Bangladesh and Pakistan as well. So what you can see in the photographs are the elements of a very big criminal economy of coal, of which is extremely carefully regulated in India from top to bottom and mined and distributed through state agencies. Bottom right is a great mafia dynast who has just been arrested. But you can see child labor, you can see kids working in abominable conditions, you can see these fortified bikes with half a ton of coal somehow being transported. You can see women with huge headloads, dreadful conditions of mining in abandoned tailings, abandoned mines, and in the top left, Indian lorries, lorry corporations, Indian state corporations being purloined for criminal transport of coal, and whole rigs of trains, whole sets of wagons of trains are regularly sequestered for criminal freight. Okay, so it's a criminal system. And this very packed slide simply shows, I'm not going to describe it even, but you have to trust me, what it shows is that right from the very top in the Ministry of Coal, right through to the Labour, which is doing that work underground, at every single point in the very heavily regulated system, there are parallel systems. There is a criminal system, an informal, come illegal, what can I say, a development, a mutation of the official organogram of how coal is produced and distributed. It's actually produced and distributed in this parallel system involving practically every department of government, and going right out into the Maoist cadres in central India who protect illegal lorry transport of coal, but require a tax with which they buy weapons. So this, from top to bottom, this is a criminalized system. So there are parallel institutions which bring order to this criminal system. Okay, so now I'm into general kind of wind up. I want to wind up about the case studies, and then I want to wind up about the project so far. One of the most important results from the case studies, which is very disquieting, is that the violation of law seems to be foundational for market economy. Now, why is that disquieting? It's because most lawyers, most legal scholars say that you can't have market economy without law. But we seem to have the opposite. We seem to have the violation of law as being foundational for the actually existing market economy. So that's a question for lawyers, and it's a question for political economists. How is this theorized? How is this possible? Then we have colossal variation in regulative scope throughout the system, in a way which creates an architecture of law which incentivizes discretionary behavior by the state and evasion and on the part of economic agents. Then the state seems deliberately to tolerate non-compliance, and its own resources are very widely commodified. I haven't really put the word corruption into this talk, but that's because corruption seems to me to be a very special case of what we're talking about. What we're talking about is much more complex than simply taking bribes. Then the global or the offshore complexity of jurisdictions, which we kind of think of mentally, I think, as territorialized. And we think of informal and formal as binaries, and we think of territories. But what we actually have is a set of jurisdictions, some of which are territorial, and they don't necessarily match, and some of which are in network form, like ditches or drains or power networks, and they don't match either. So the complexity of the jurisdictions of the state are fantastic, much, much greater than the binary theories would have you believe. And this actively fragments market exchange. So you've got fragmented state and you've got fragmented markets. So you also have new kinds of hybrids, as I showed you in the coal slide. So a new vocabulary is being invented by people who are grappling with this complexity. So we have new phrases, and I just flag them because I'm sure there'll be more neologisms, more new terms for this, as the importance of these hybrid institutions is appreciated by scholars and also by policymakers. So we have hybrid institutions, we have hybrid state, we have shadow state, we have graded informality, just as we have graded in hierarchy in the studies of caste. And we have selective informality. These are not my terms. These are terms coming out of the literature where people have tried to understand what's going on. And then we have social relations across the regulative frontiers, which are a mix of compliance, full compliance, partial compliance, and utter non-compliance and total ignorance. And across this frontier, we have the preeminence of non-state regulative relations. So this is a huge challenge, I think, to researching informality. Okay. And in the market, those are the implications of the 7 cases for relations in the state. And relations in the market go on from that there is an elision between these compliant, regulated, informal, and criminal capitalist relations, and that they are good to think with separately, but they don't exist separately in the economy. They're meshed. Accumulation then has to be understood as subject to plural values and plural regulative practices. And so there is a powerful stream of political economy suggesting that because of this, they're outside capitalism. But I will conclude the opposite, that they're not outside capitalism, that capitalism is stratified. We stylized it as bimodal in the exercise with artificial intelligence, but the cases are much more differentiated than that. And we have to recognize that Indian capitalism, at any rate, is quite heavily stratified. And at the base, there are at least 63 million. We know that from the latest economic census data. 63 million kinship enterprises, very, very small enterprise. And they have been called, again, in the literature, they're called all kinds of names. This is not to argue there are no differentiating processes acting in the economy. Of course there are. But there's a kind of flaw at which expansion takes place by multiplication of numbers rather than concentration and centralization of capital. And these small enterprises have been recognized by various authors, not always studying India, as molecular. David Harvey calls it molecular. Varvarosis calls it rhizomatic. Pamela Cawthorne, amoebic. Suri Kesar talks about it as fragile, but very persistent. It may be fragile, but it's persistent. Meanwhile, you have the illusion of wage labour and family labour in a paradox that the more essential the work, the worse the working conditions. And so we have plenty of evidence from the case studies that wages are shifting in an adverse way. Real wages are not increasing. The relationship between wages and profits is shifting over time toward profit and away from wages. So I will leave it there because time must be running out. And I will now sort of finish with just a few more slides, very few, which are more general conclusions about the double exercise, the exercise using AI and the exercise using case studies. What do we take away, and is it relevant to where you are? Firstly, that hypothesis that informality needs reconceiving as the politics of selective enforcement and selective compliance is not rejected. And the cases show processes and relations in a way that the AI doesn't do so well. The AI is very good at factual questions, and the case study are very good at processes and relations. Second, informal economy is a fuzzy concept. It's a concept subject to multiple meanings. It's compromised. It's certainly generative of scholarly disagreement, but it does not exist in a binary form in the actually existing capitalist economy of India, despite the fact that this is how the data is published. Dualist models do little to help us understand it. We have to replace it by some neologism, some new phrase for what it actually is. And I've suggested non-state regulated economy, NSRE, but that's a big mouthful. So I'm challenging everybody to find a better word for it. It's certainly not unregulated because even though most of the literature that we consult refers to it as unregulated, I hope to have shown today that it's not unregulated. It's socially regulated, it's also state regulated. And that form of regulation varies colossally according to a crude modeling of size and organization of firms in the economy, but it's certainly not confined to small firms. And I would even go further and say that if we all ignore all this, go home and forget it, or residualize it, or at best continue to binarize the informal economy, we're being complicitous in a technology of bureaucratic power that leads to policy processes and a kind of blinkered universe of policy which reproduce the very problems that the policies are apparently intended to address. India's state regulative order is judged in the literature, the wider literature, as very complicated. So we are dealing with a case of one extreme of complication of regulation with a vast number of amendments, unstable revisions, range of legal interpretations of given law. And my conclusion is that this was and always has been and is quite deliberate, that regulative law has never been intended to be accessible to the people regulated, that enforcement has never intended to be other than selective and politicized, and that serves a purpose. And that the non-state regulated economy is not just a residual, but has been created with intention. And I think this has big implications for public policy. That actually existing bureaucratic order has been formed and is path dependent now because of the social practices and the power relations that result from this regulative architecture. The Comoros have called this lawfare, and that concept of lawfare has been evoked to try to cover where informal state politics meets the social structures of accumulation, as I have tried to frame it. And that lawfare is a very, very complicated zone. But we must accept that the violation of laws serves a purpose. It serves a wider social purpose and not just a purpose for the violators. So just as collective activity is necessary for competition, informal behavior and rule violation is vital for the non-state regulated economy. And what do we have? Here I'm repeating what I said earlier. We have an economy which is given order and regulated by socially oppressive relations of authority. And there's a whole list. These are the ones that are common in the Indian literature, and they may be different where you are. And there we do have to recognize a new wave of Dalit studies of intersectionality, which are not studying these institutions as isolated institutions, like what is the impact of gender on the economy? And there's a huge body of literature that asks that question. Or how does caste manifest itself in the contemporary Indian economy? So these institutions are being studied as individual institutions, but there is a new wave which is trying to look at intersectionality. It's very, very difficult. Again, this slide is summarizing things that I've said earlier. The second point on the slide is that the units of practice of authority in the economy are often quite small and local, and not the national market, which national politics is trying to push. So that's setting up hypotheses about struggles between national regulative institutions, state institutions, and local social institutions. And those institutions have persisted. There's a remarkable continuity through from the 1990s to the present. So a lot of literature in political economy is hung up on the 1990s as a great cusp moment when socialism ceded to capitalism, to be extremely crude, or where state-led development ceded to private sector development. However, what we look at in the informal economy is a great deal of persistence, rather than of it being a turning point. The last point on this slide, or on this almost last slide, is that this institutional matrix sets up incentives and compulsions to expand in different ways, to differentiate in classical volume 1 of capital way, but also to miniaturize and to expand by multiplication. So that in itself is an oversimplification. Bimodality is a simplification, but it's something to think with. So actually what's going on in the Indian economy is more complicated than that. And there are all kinds of intermediate complications. I mean, you only have to think about a small town 50 years ago and now. 50 years ago, the shops were all made of brick or mud with thatch or tiled roofs. Now everything is concrete, multi-story, glassed in, and some of it is air conditioned. So that is not ticking over through subsistence. That is a kind of accumulation. However, all those shops are small family businesses. Yes, they're very, very, very distinctively not the way an American town center would be organized, through branches and franchises of great multinational corporations. So there are very complex models going on of accumulation and expansion in India, which it's exciting to start theorizing and recognizing and researching. Okay, last slide. What do I think really needs doing? What the two exercises I did over the summer definitely were bad at. What was the actual political economy over the frontier, if you like, between the regulative boundaries and the non-regulated economy. Prem Shankar Jha, in his latest book, called it wormy dust. I think that's a lovely term for it, wormy dust. We need to figure out what's going on inside that wormy dust at the frontier of state regulation and social regulation. Then what I've talked about is very frustrating because there are 28 states of India, and I've been talking in a gross way about India as an entity. But what's actually going on is another layer of politics which I haven't talked about at all between state level, 28 state level capacities and central government capacities. And there's a whole politics of state and centre which are pretty neglected in political economy. But if you've stayed with me up to this point, you'll realize we can't neglect it. And then there's a mirror project for the socially regulated equivalents that I have talked about, gender and class and race and ethnicity and language and place. How does authority get reproduced through these institutions? In particular, is there a way in which these institutions are violated? And then how are those violations regulated and punished? All of that is very poorly researched in India and probably elsewhere. And lastly, there are big problems for how we know what we know. Certainly, I think the experiments I did this summer with AI met its limits because it's clearly not very good at answering these questions, even though it's probably quite good at answering factual questions. And if there's no literature, and if AI meets a limit, then we have no alternative but to pursue this through fieldwork. And that has all kinds of possibilities, but also all kinds of limitations. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for hanging in and listening to this talk. And I wish you well in whatever you do with it. And I'm very interested in feedback.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much for your time and also giving us this kind of intensive lecture. I think I had to stop. Could you please stop sharing so that we can see you blink?
I'm sorry, I can't. I've got a.
Okay,
I've got a script. Can you stop it? Skip. I've got it.
Right. Yes. Kosal, thank you, Barbara. Thank you once again. So. I have, okay, now the floor is open for question. As an organizer, I'm acting like a dictator and asking the first question.
Okay.
So the first question, there is a question, so I can't ignore that. Now, we have a question here, which is by Nabra. Nabra, would you like to ask by yourself, which is best, and we always encourage that? Unfortunately. Okay. So in that sense,
it's a long question.
It's a long question. Is selective informality in advanced Western economy and in late developing countries such as Turkey and India driven by similar strategic political choices, or does it emerge primarily from structural constraint and capacity limitations in late developers? So because we are late, is it because of that such complexity is arriving? And the second part, moreover, is there any qualitative shift between the informality management practices pre-21st century and production-based Western capitalism and the new strategies shaped by digitization and the rise of AI? And the last part is, finally, even if selective informality operate through comparable mechanism across these divergent trajectories of capitalist development, how can we explain the markedly different effects it produces on income inequality? Wow, these are deep ones. Barbara, over to you.
Actually, they're brilliant questions. They're very, very good questions. I hope Nevra is around, even if they're not available.
No, she's here. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the questions, and you've definitely understood what I was trying to say. But I'm not sure I can answer any of them. But they're the kinds of questions that I think need to be asked to take this argument forward, or to criticize it, to trash what I've just said. Okay, to take the first one. Firstly, I don't know enough about Turkey, and I haven't thought about this comparatively. I've just tried to figure out what's going on in one country. So the question is a very good one, but it's a different project. But I'm not trying to get out of the question. An orthodox political economist would stress the different strategic political choices in a dirigist, a state-driven import substituting industrial model from a neoliberal model. So that is the starting point. But what I found actually is that most of the laws which matter are heavily path dependent and very old, right? Many of them, the most important one of all, company law, which has been recently reformulated, and that's true also of labor laws. They've got so amended and complex and difficult to understand that finally the Indian government has reformulated them for the 21st century. But until then, they were being amended. The Essential Commodities Act, which covers essential commodities in India, has been amended over 70 times. And it has been said that there isn't a lawyer who actually understands it anymore. It's actually surpassing cognitive capacity. So I would say that that kind of evidence suggests structural constraints, or at least the power of path-dependent law over the forces which require reform to that law in order to flourish. So yeah, constraint is a very good suggestion to research. The second question. So I kind of started to answer that, but I don't know enough about digitalization, the rise of artificial intelligence, except that I've used it quite explicitly. But you're not talking about it as a research assistant. You're talking about it as a transformer of production. And there, I'm not the right person to answer that question. But there is a new field of digital sociology, digital political economy, which is trying to address that. Someone like Yanis Varoufakis is much better qualified to answer that question. But again, it's a good question to ask. How can we, even if it operates through comparable mechanisms, and we don't really know what mechanisms, or what micro politics operate for big business and for small business across divergent frontiers, how can we explain different effects and the production of income inequality? For that, we need to know much more about small units of production under capitalism and the constraints of smallness on expansion by accumulation, concentration, centralization of capital, management constraints within small family businesses, things like that. There are objective constraints and not just simply adverse exchange relations that small family business faces compared with larger, big business entities. So again, this is a question that is a research question and very difficult to answer. To answer it, we need to know much more about the politics of capture of subsidies, the politics of tax evasion, yeah, and the way those politics differ for small units and large units. So I'm aware that I'm not giving tremendously good answers, but they're very, very important questions. So thank you very much for asking them.
Thank you, Navra, for this question. Yeah, thank you. So if there is anyone else who would like to ask question,
There's
otherwise, yeah. So okay, I have a very simple question. I have always this habit of trying to simplify things. So I was wondering if informality is a fuzzy concept, which is really it is, as you have demonstrated. Um, um, how to deal with it? I mean, how we can begin understanding. We have seen in the last few slides, you have indicated by drawing some of the features about it. So how we should begin dealing with it? Because economics or any social science has a tendency to follow natural science and try to find or establish relationship in a very mechanical sense. So if you like the old model, if you increase the demand, the supply should interact. So it's like very simplified things, and you push some buttons here and there, and then you get some outcome. So how we deal in a model of economic theory, this fuzziness?
First, I think this is another very good question. For me, it follows on from Nevra's question. We have to distinguish, I have to distinguish from now on anyway, informal economic practices, yes, from being small. Yeah, that we need to call a spade, that if you followed what I've said and don't want to trash it, then informality is pervasive.
Yeah.
Okay, informal economic practices are pervasive.
Mm.
That opens up a new field of research. And what I have suggested is complexity, even though I've tried to stylize the Indian economy in terms of two kinds of firm. It can be explored in all manner of different ways, different sectors, different regions, different kinds of economic entity. But we need to know a lot more about how informal economic practices differentiate or advantage certain kinds of firm. Yes, and all the time we have to spread eagle the economy and the state. Yeah, so it's been very easy to study the informal economy without studying the state. But I think if you've got this far with my argument, you now have to upend that simple idea, which is born of duality, and devise new methods, new research to look at the informal economic practices across the regulative frontiers as they're actually implemented, not as they just are in law, and to distinguish that from the particular problems of being small in India. And I'm not sure about Turkey and where else people are located, Cambodia, but the Indian economy is, during the era of liberalization, has seen a vast proliferation of tiny firms. Even the economic census, we may criticize its crudeness, but the economic census shows that between 1990 and 2022, the average number of employees in a registered firm went from 3 to 1.7. It declined. It did the opposite of concentrating and accumulating. The number of firms expanded vastly. And not just India, but China. In 2015, the heads, engineering hard-nosed heads of the Chinese Communist Party realized that factory industry wasn't going to absorb the educated labor that was leaving rural areas, coming to the eastern and southern coastline, and set a planned project for self-employment, unleashed that planned project, which is finance, technology, infrastructure, space, all kinds of skilling. And from practically none, there are now 132 million self-employed startups in China, employing 300 million people. So India doesn't have a project like that, and for these small firms. So one of the takeouts I got from this summer for our understanding and further research is to distinguish the small from the informal, that they're different, and they overlap, of course. But as research project, and certainly for development, in new political economy, I get quite exercised by the fact that so many people refer to it all as labor. Labor is a dustbin. Labor is everything that isn't capital, and capital is big business. And so everything that isn't big business is labor, which is not helped by the labor laws themselves. But in between capital in a pure form and labor in a pure form, you've got a truly enormous part of the Indian economy, which is capital and labor bound up in small units, for which there isn't as yet a project anything like as coherent as China has sort of developed in the last 10 years. So I think whatever your politics, whether you're right wing or left wing, this is a problem, right?
Yeah. So just to follow, I'm not sure whether you are you want to answer this, because you have lived in England, you are English. So do you see any difference between Indian and English informality in terms of nature and maybe forms, maybe function, how they function? I'm assuming in both countries there are some sort of informality taking place. Of course, India you have studied intensively.
Good question. Different question. A bit like Nevra's question about India and Turkey. I haven't studied Britain in depth enough to give a competent answer to that question. There was a moment when I was working on informality with criminologists of the EU. And at that point, which is quite some time ago, about 15 years ago, I discovered that there is quite an extensive informal economy in the UK and in Europe. But whereas India's estimated at about 45% of GDP, in Europe it's somewhere around 15. So it's smaller. And for many people, it's a criminal economy. And so the difference between informal, shadow, criminal is elided in that sociological work, which looks at the UK. The name is Colin Williams, who works in Sheffield. Is an authority on informal economy in the UK. But there is a group of scholars who work on it. But it's not a literature that I'm actually up to speed on right now.
I asked this question just to get a sense if this is an exceptional or a peculiarity of Indian economy only, or you see it as a...
Yeah, well, we do know that India has the largest one in the world, largest informal economy in the world. And there are very few countries which have a proportion of GDP thought to be informal, a larger proportion. So it's both absolutely and relatively quite a significant player. And there is a comparative literature looking at South Africa, looking at BRICS countries, not Russia. Well, Russia has its own literature, but looking at South Africa and Brazil in comparative terms. WIEGO, based in Harvard, Women in the Informal Economy Globalizing Organizing, WIEGO. They have a website where these data are regularly updated and where you can compare other countries. I myself haven't done that, but there's certainly a body of literature. However, What I am suggesting today as different is this idea that informality is pervasive. And so most of the data that's published worldwide reinforces the idea of duality and of binary classifications.
Yeah. And you, if I have not mistaken, you have also suggested it's a part of the whole design of capitalism, right? It's not something
Yes.
exceptional.
Yes, and that is, again, work that needs to be done. And the legal paradox that the violation of law seems to be fundamental to market exchange in India is a big problem for me, because I'm not a lawyer. I'm not or a sociologist of law, but I do know that there are many schools of legal interpretation, amongst which you have both extremes. You have people who say, no, market economy depends on the rule of law, and the violation of the rule of law compromises market economy. And then you have a kind of Marxist who says, no, accumulation is just raw dog process, yes? And the law is a bit of an encumbrance, and so the violation of law is routine in capitalist accumulation. So there are two very opposed views, and within those extreme views, there are quite a few other legal interpretations about the concept of violation, and whether law itself depends on the concept of violation. So the concept of violation is in a way prior to law. And then depending on whether you are, whether you belong to a school of legal interpretation, legal interpretivism, so that law is not something that is a thing. Law is constantly being negotiated and fought and established through precedent. And that then in turn depends where you belong to in terms of what law is, whether it's created through judgment and precedent and debate, or whether it's laid down, as in some Mediterranean countries, as a state-backed body of which shall not be amended. So
There is another one.
that's a colossal field. It's a colossal field. It's not my field, but it's the problem is it's the way in which this work is pushing future work, I think. So very challenging.
Yeah. I see Navra is again asking another question, and it must be
Another question.
What do you think about the relationship between the selective informality and democratic or institutional constitution? I believe selective informality directly shape political regime types and income inequality in both advanced Western economy and late developing economies like Turkey and India. In the sense, can selective informality be understood not only as a product of state capacity constraint, but also a strategic component of regime maintenance? I see. Is it a strategy?
If it's a strategy, it has a very long historical tail. And earlier strategy may now be contemporary path dependence, part of the informal politics of regime maintenance. So this is another excellent question. I don't have the answer to it, but one response to it, which is not trying to duck the question, but how would you design research to test that question? Yeah, because it's a massive question. You're studying the case. Well, congratulations, and I wish you well.
Good luck.
I should be hugely interested in how you've designed your research, Nevra, to pursue this. And I feel that it's highly original, and really important, and wish you well with it.
Barbara, please write it to write about it to Professor.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. So if there is any more question, please ask. Kosal, would you like to ask any question?
Okay, thank you so much. Very interesting, and I learned a lot in terms of definition and the term that we use in informality. So I just want a basic question about the research methodology because I saw that you use AI and train AI to answer seven research
Yes.
question on that topic in the case of India. Can you say a little
Yes.
what is the challenge and sometimes the information that it provide to us is
Right.
nonsense, and so how you can select use the best answer or the answer that makes sense and makes sense for the
Yeah.
conclusion of your study.
So this year, I've had a lot of discussions in India about AI, but mainly AI replacing thought among students and how we as teachers can retain a vocation which depends on enabling students to think. When at a flash, in a half second, you can get AI to write an essay for you. In this case, I feel completely clean, above board, about using AI. But your question is very important to take seriously. Before I used AI, I wasn't sure. Yes? What we have to do is to be honest about what we're using it to do. So in my case, I was using it to scope available knowledge about factual questions, and I got replies. And one reason why I asked so many questions was that I tested the search engine beforehand with different terms or phrased the question differently. And it is true that if you put in different terms, you get different answers. So I used the same terms and I justified them as being neutral terms, not theoretically precise terms. I could have used petty commodity production instead of small family business, and I might well have got a different result. In fact, I might well have got no result because the literature doesn't really cover the regulation of petty commodity production. We know this. So again, some background knowledge of the literature is very useful in enabling one to figure out how good a research assistant AI sweeping the internet has been. Then one is aware of firewalls. There are academic journals which are not available to AI, right? So there's a kind of public information on the internet which is available to these search engines. And then there is information which we as scholars may well be able to get at through Google Search or Google Scholar or other academic search mechanisms, which is not there. So my project, which already has generated a vast amount of information, is confined to what is there, right? So it may not be a complete project, but I console myself with the idea that even if I had a research assistant, which I don't have any resources for, being 14 years into retirement, that research assistant would have taken 2 years and might not have been able to scour the literature as effectively as this search mechanism. So yes, it's not flawless. Yes, it depends on terms. Yes, it was not very good at eliciting data on processes and relationships. And that's where different ways of knowing, like ethnographies and surveys and case material, is very valuable. And I don't see them as being alternative ways of knowing. They're meshed together to help us understand what's going on. We must experiment constantly with AI, not to write our papers for us, but to answer factual questions and shortcut search processes which would otherwise take very, very, very long time or be impossible. I may not have answered your question fully, but I hope I've started to answer it, that I feel AI is very useful, that we shouldn't regard it as a threat, although it is a threat to our students. And it could be a threat if it stops you thinking. But in the case of this experiment, it actually provoked thinking. It did the opposite of replace thinking. It generated all kinds of thinking. And Nevra in Turkey is following up certain trains which I would never have got to other than through AI. Not that she got to it through AI, she got to it through another process, and she's researching it without AI, I guess. But I got to it that way.
Thank you. Sattwick, you need to open your mic.
So thank you, Barbara. So Nadine, I'm giving you a chance if you want to ask any question. Otherwise, we will end the session by thanking Barbara once again. Thank you for your time. And it's like reading a book today. It was a lot of things to process, and I'm sure I'm going to think about it, especially because it's a case of informality, which puzzles all of us every time when we get out of the house or even within our house.
Yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for your time. And we'll be in touch. And I will encourage Navra and Nadine to join us next time. We have a lecture on slavery and capitalism. Please follow the YSI portal. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you for the wonderful feedback. I'm really grateful.
Thank you.